You're welcome along to the polling station. Paul Krishnamurty is back. Paul, how are you doing?
Good, Johnny. Yourself?
I'm good. Neil Channing, you were a little bit lost. He said, I've been wrapped up in the golf this morning, and I didn't know if the last few days, we didn't know if you meant that really annoying sport played by rich people or that quite complex area in which a lot of rich people live. That was to you, Neil Channing.
Oh, I thought that was to Paul. I'm sorry. I was waiting. I thought, but I bet Paul's got a right zinger to come back with here. Oh dear, I thought he hasn't thought of a thing to say. I've got nothing to say on that matter.
Okay. How did you get on Racing TV on Sunday?
Very good, yes. And then I think I was in the studio at 9, and I went to bed just after the Super Bowl finished at 4. So a long old shift, really.
Oh, Super Bowl, of course.
Yeah, and for people of our age, William, that's actually a hell of an achievement to last that long without falling asleep these days, although you can't really attest to that, you're a little bit younger.
Those people who know me will know that I have fallen asleep on a fair few occasions after long shifts or long nights. So no, I cannot fly my millennial colours and claim to be a Duracell bunny of any sort.
We'll stay with you, the latest polling and a little bit of discrepancy in terms of how well Labour is doing. Not that much has happened in the last week, but on today's show, we've plenty to get through. We're going to talk about 2 interesting constituencies in the next election. We'll talk about Northern Ireland as well. Fascinating poll putting Sinn Féin in front. Donald Trump's big legal problems, and in terms of his accountants all jumping ship. But first to you, Mr. Kedjanyi, what's going on in terms of the latest polling in the UK?
So there's been quite a bit of noise recently because at the beginning of this week, or over the weekend, I should say, there were 2 polls with contrasting methodologies that both had Labour just 3 points ahead. Now, obviously, given recent events and the polling average, which has shifted quite a lot, that raised some eyebrows. The first was from opinion. And this is a really interesting one. And I just want to dig in a bit, basically, because the new methodology they've used here is a fairly interesting change, I think. First things to note also is that there's a new 3-point lead for Labour here, but it's absolutely not a smaller one. It's just a difference in methodology. So it's not a big drop. We'll go on to that later. But what they have done is they've put more emphasis on turnout weighting to ensure that their voters are representative of those who actually go to the polls in elections. So they've decreased the importance that many Tory voters have moved to undecided, and as such, they're out of those headline voting figures. And it is a big part of the reason for the recent Labour lead. There are a lot of Tories who have moved to don't know or undecided. So you put those changes in and you have Labour on 37, Tories on 34, Lib Dems on 11, and the Greens on 6%, interestingly. Now, a lot of people thought that's very interesting. And I do think it does shine a bit of a light on the fact that whilst Labour does have a definite poll lead, it is not absolutely rock solid. No poll lead really, I think, ever is apart from certain circumstances. And it's just something to keep in mind when you're thinking about anything related to the polling narrative. Then you had a couple of days on. I'll speed up now. My apologies for getting a bit into the weeds.
All right.
Then you had a YouGov poll, which had a much smaller lead for Labour compared to recent ones. They were on 37, the Tories on 34. Labour had lost 4 points, the Tories had gained 2, the Greens had gained 2, and the Lib Dems had stayed the same. And again, this had the usual reactions. I think you can pretty much telegraph people's reaction to the poll now. I think people who are mainly on the left would point at weaknesses in Starmer. I think people on the centre would come to defend him. That there are 2 competing fandoms there, I think. People on the right who support the Tories would be comfortably, I think, of the opinion that plenty of voters will return home. And Lib Dems and the Greens actually recently seemed pretty happy with where they are in the polls. I think it's worth noting that there are big margins of error sometimes in these, and different polls have different methodologies, and it's a snapshot of where we are. But a bit of interesting noise over the weekend, and I should say, in the interest of balance today, we've had the Savanta Comres poll, which has given Keir Starmer his best Prime Minister score. He's 39 to Boris Johnson's 30, and Labour are leading by about 10. So lots of interesting movements, and that new methodology will be something really interesting to track.
One thing just to quickly say, because we often talk about how betting markets are more efficient than polls. The betting market on Labour, most seats at the next general election, is currently 2.36 to 2.42. That has never moved out of a range of 2.3 to 2.44 in the last 4 months. When the polls were 14 and when the polls were 3, it's just stayed exactly the same.
That's a good point. It's the same here. We have not seen really big moves on the most seats market for Labour at the next election.
And Neil, obviously Keir Starmer moving further and further away from his predecessor in terms of what he says and so forth. And it is his predecessor's constituency that's one of the two you want to talk about today.
Yeah, well, we were just talking that because it's parliamentary recess, what the hell were we going to talk about on the programme? And I noticed a few people the other day talking about Islington North. Obviously, there was some briefing to the Times last week where some Starmer people were saying, basically, even if Corbyn apologises for whatever it is that they think he's done, they're not going to give him the whip back. So it will become a question at some stage, what he does about the next general election. If they do decide to select a different Labour candidate to put up against him, and his local party are not allowed to select him as their candidate, which is looking likely to happen. There might be some legal battle about whether that's allowed to happen. He's in a tricky situation. There's actually a financial thing in it as well. If you lose an election as an MP and lose your seat, you get money for you get a month's money for every year that you've been a politician, up to £33,500. So he's got £33,500 coming on the day that he finally loses Islington North. But if he ever steps down and decides to just retire, he doesn't get that money. So a lot of times when you see somebody lose the whip, they will stand as an independent and not even really try. That happened quite a bit in the last election. There were 2 or 3 people that didn't hardly even bother and got kind of 800 votes as an independent. And they got for them, it was smaller money, 20 grand or something like that. So I don't know. It's interesting. I sort of feel like there's a good chance he doesn't want to stand against the Labour Party. He's been a Labour member his whole life. He's got a lot of friends in the Labour Party. But if he was to stand, then there's a question of, does he stand as an independent, or is it a case that he's formed a new party? I think if he stands as an independent, he's got way more chance of winning than if he stands under some kind of new ticket. If it's literally just people seeing the words Jeremy Corbyn on the ballot and there's nothing else written around it, he's got very good recognition in Islington North. There was some polling after the 2019 election that said that people, the main criteria for people on the way they voted, only 6% of people said it was their local candidate. I would say Jeremy Corbyn could easily be a slight exception to that, because he has high name recognition from being a leader in the past. He's been the MP there for so long. He's very popular locally. I have a couple of friends that live there that don't vote Labour, and they say to me, yeah, he's a good MP, he's a good constituency MP. Over the course of the time he's been there, he'll have done many, many Friday surgeries and dealt with lots of people's problems. It's quite hard to live in Islington North for a long time without knowing someone that he's helped out in the past. So I do think he's got quite a good chance. There's going to be, I would imagine there'll be 1,000 people that are either former Labour members or current Labour members that are going to get chucked out if they do it, that would go and knock on doors for him. That can make a difference. But the negative is you don't have the data. You need to know, when you're trying to win an election, you need to know which doors to knock on. You need to know where your support is. And obviously with GDPR and everything, he can't steal the Labour Party information. So he'll be playing blind there. He'll be randomly knocking on a door, not knowing whether the person was a Tory voter in the past, or a Lib Dem or whatever. So, and that that's going to waste a lot of time in an election. Essentially, in general elections, you just want to knock on your own supporters' door and remind them to vote. I don't know. It's very tricky. I don't know how I really want to price it up. I think if it was as an independent standing against Labour, if we look in the 2019 election, you got David Gauke for the Tories and Dominic Grieve for the Tories. They both stood as independents when they lost the whip. I think Dominic Grieve was about somewhere in the region of 7-2 to win, and David Gauke was about 11-2 to win. David Gauke lost by 15,000 and Dominic Grieve lost by 17,000. So the market definitely thought they had a chance, and basically they got totally thrashed. I think Corbyn's got more of a chance than either of those two. He's obviously much more well known than they were. I don't know, 45%, maybe 5-4. What do you think, Paul?
Paulie T got 73% the last election. He turned 73 this year.
I think about 7-4, 2-1 would be where I.
Do you think he'll stand? Do you think he'll stand? If Labour say we're going to pick a new candidate, we're not going to let you stand, do you think he'll do it?
I'm sceptical that he would. It depends on the situation. If you're in a situation where it's really, really close next election, highly unpredictable, all to play for, then I think if Corbyn runs, he'll get thrashed, right? Because people will be, very much more disciplined. I think if Labour are 7% ahead in the polls, there's every chance he stands. Because in that situation, people, particularly a safe Labour constituency like that, knowing that they're not really letting the Tories in that seat, right? Voting for Corbyn, then I think he might run.
Well, if he becomes an independent MP, he's hardly likely to vote along with the Tories on lots of issues.
Exactly. If in a situation where people are less certain about, I'm pretty confident that Starmer's going to win. If we're in a sort of new Labour situation where they're well ahead, I could see it happening. But I am sceptical. I'm slightly sceptical he'll do it at all. It's a long way off. He's not young, and it'd be a very nasty fight. It will be a.
How would you price up, William, that he actually runs?
I'd say probably about 6-4. I think would be
6-4 he runs. Do you agree with my point that if he was to stand, I don't know, maybe as the Peace and Justice Party or something like that, he would have less chance than if he just stands as Jeremy Corbyn independent?
Maybe a little. I should think that given because we're dealing with a really quite a unique situation in the sense that he embodies the area politically so much in a way that I think fairly few MPs do. You would think if you were on the side of backing him, hypothetically, in the situation, it shouldn't make too much difference whether he does it with the Peace and Justice Party or not. But just Jeremy Corbyn independent, probably a slightly easier sell, I'd say.
I'd say it too. It's about name recognition, and he has got massive name recognition. Peace and Justice Party, you could start campaigning now and they wouldn't have a strong brand at the next election.
One thing also that could come into play here is who do Labour select? Who wins that selection process to go and take on Corbyn, right? Is it somebody who, nobody could match to his name recognition there, but is it relatively high profile person who jumped? Or
no, local councillor with decades of experience.
Local councillor with decades of experience. I think that would have an impact too. Hypothetically speaking. And then there's also, I guess, the resource issue. Neil pointed on it with the door knocking data as well. But I'm not saying that Corbyn couldn't fundraise a lot or raise a decent amount, certainly for a seat contest.
Well, you're only allowed to spend about 12 grand on a seat. So in the short campaign, if the election's called a long way out, they could spend a bit more money in the run up to the election, but he doesn't really need that much money.
That's a fair point.
I think it's more to do with the data, knowing where your voters are. I think that's a bit easier in a place like Islington North than in a Beaconsfield or something where it's geographically, further apart. you know, talking about Dominic Grieve, I think it was quite difficult for him because he's got a big constituency, you know, area-wise to get round, and he, you know, he didn't really have that many helpers. Corbyn's, you know, it's a pretty compact constituency, and you know, you can roughly tell what are the kind of properties that are likely to have Labour voters in.
Yeah. Sticking with you, Neil, Canterbury's your next call.
Well, yeah, I thought Canterbury was quite interesting. So we've got this MP there, Rosie Duffield. She won with a, you know, quite surprisingly, really, for most people, I think, in 2017. I think she was about 6-1 2 weeks before the election and about 7-4 on election day. She won by under 200 votes. Can't remember exactly, maybe 167. It rings a bell. Anyway, she won it. She got huge amounts of help from Momentum. People going down there to knock on doors. There were very few target seats in the south for them to go to. As soon as she won, she basically denounced Momentum and said that they were all awful, which was great. And then the 2019 election, people didn't really come out to help her quite as much, but she managed to increase her majority, which of course she put down to her amazing personal mandate. She's been getting herself very busy in the whole kind of trans, inverted commas, debate. And I don't know whether you remember, but during the first lockdown, she popped off to Wales when she wasn't supposed to leave her house to visit her boyfriend. There's been some speculation from local members that she's actually moved to Wales to be with him and she hasn't been seen in the constituency. Now, I'm saying that's not me saying that. That's definitely speculation from local members. She's threatened to, well, nothing's been done about it, but she's threatened legal action and said that those people are spreading malicious gossip about her and that she's being targeted harassment from certain people. She's then come out and said that Keir Starmer's not really supported her throughout that. And she's contemplating leaving the party or possibly crossing the floor. That hasn't led to Keir Starmer calling her in and having a nice chat and supporting her. He's just ignored her now. So I don't know. We don't really know if she's going to be the candidate or still around, or whether she'll have become a Tory by the time of the next election and Canterbury will have turned blue. The one thing that's quite interesting about the Canterbury seat is there are 2 universities in Canterbury. And there were 4 constituencies in the UK with 2 universities. And Labour managed to win 3 of them in 2017 and hold on to all 3 of them in 2019. And it was kind of a surprise. They were all odds against, or 2 of them were odds against. So people seemed quite surprised by that. But I can't really, it's kind of weird, isn't it, that the market was so surprised that a fellow running on the policy of free tuition fees should win the 3 constituencies that they were in the running for, which have 2 universities. If the Labour right decide, which they probably will, to dump the free tuition fees policy, I think that will be quite bad in Canterbury. But the other thing is that there are going to be some boundary changes there. It's not actually going to be called Canterbury. I can't remember. It's going to be Canterbury and something, not Aimsham. Don't worry. Something more pronounceable. But I think basically it's going to go a bit more Tory. I did actually ask somebody for one of the firms if they could have a shot at pricing this up, and they said they'd make Labour 8 to 11. I think I'd probably back the Tories at 8 to 11 if I knew there was a 2024 election, especially with the boundary changes. I don't know. What does anyone else think?
So, Paul, Neil is looking into a 2024 election in a constituency, the boundary of which is actually going to change, and we don't know if the incumbent is actually going to change from Labour to Tories.
Yeah, I know. I actually, if you remember, I suggested we should talk about Yvette Cooper's seat, but we did a late switcheroo to Canterbury. Canterbury's pretty interesting, though.
It is. Paul, come in and help us here.
I fully expect the Tories to win that seat because I think the boundary changes will help them. And in any case, Labour had no margin there. It was, there's a rock solid kind of 45% Tory vote there. The one thing I would say, perhaps in their favour, is this would be one of those so-called blue wall seats that supposedly there is a bit of a rebellion to Brexit and Boris Johnson. And, if you live in Kent I don't live in Kent. I don't live anywhere near Kent, so I can't really comment. But I know that they've got 20-mile-an-hour traffic jams every day going up to Dover. So the failure of the Tory government is certainly something that people in Canterbury should be aware of, right? And, you know, if she's the local MP, if she, you know, she does have a record as local MP, if she did cross the floor, she'd win, probably.
Actually, it's going to be called Canterbury and Faversham, so you might struggle with that one, Will.
You might what? Sorry.
Well, Will struggled a bit, didn't he, with Chesham and Amish?
Yeah.
Interesting enough, William, Canterbury was very, very split on Brexit, actually, as I look here. 51 leave, 49 remain.
Yeah. I mean, I'm of the opinion that Paul has. I do think it will go Tory, which possibly might be influencing a potential decision from Duffield to jump ship from Labour to the Tories. When this was in the news, because the Guardian reported it 2 weeks ago, and there was all the fever debate, I saw a good point made by somebody on the timeline whose name, annoyingly, I can't remember, which just suggested that usually MPs who are going to defect from one party to another do not telegraph it so publicly. I have a very recent example, of course, Christian Wakeford, who, even though he had been
I've done my money. I bet we'd never hear his name again. Oh, no.
Oh, God, sorry. Apologies, Neil. But even though he'd been in talks, presumably, with quite senior figures in the Labour Party, it came as a pretty big shock to everybody else. And it's possible, and I don't want to be alluding too much to Duffield's methods here or to her motivations, but it is possible that this might be a very public nudge of Labour for more support for any amount of reasons, and that this is a sort of wake-up call reminder that she's sending rather than a really dedicated intention to jump. I also wonder, and maybe it's just me, I also wonder if she was to jump, would there be much appetite in the Tory party for her to come on board? Because it's not as if that they're getting, you know, sort of a guaranteed pickup of a seat here. You know, they might well win it.
Yeah, they take it. It's about owning the other side. Everything now is about owning the other side, and that would. And you know, do they believe in anything anymore? The Tories, anyway. I don't know.
But if she jumps, I don't know, 2 years before an election, they're kind of lumbered with her as their MP, whereas they've got a whole bunch of people on their list that are looking for a seat.
The problem, if she were to do, because the whole problem is going to be around Brexit, because it's going to be very hard for her as a Kent MP who voted for Remain, campaigned on Remain, won the seat as a consequence of the referendum, to now start defending as a Tory, as a sitting.
Yeah. The reason that constituency is very split on Brexit is because it's students against locals. You know, the students all voted Remain, and obviously not all of them, but you know what I mean. That's where the split comes in.
Okay, and actually it's fascinating just looking at the discrepancy there on that list. 25, 75, 75, 25 in places, just a few miles apart. Let's get on to the US, William Kedjanyi. Donald Trump's problems are actually getting a little bit worrying for even Trump himself. He has drifted for the next election. His accountancy firm has effectively abandoned him. He has a slew of legal cases coming up against him, and he probably won't admit it, but he has reason to be worried at the moment.
He does, yeah. The legal cases against him and the investigations are really stepping up. God, I really thought I was past the days of talking about mad stuff Trump does. But just recently, and I promise you, by the way, I'm not lying, right? When I say this, you can go and search this up. But recently, investigators went to Mar-a-Lago. They went to the White House residence, and it was staff, and according to a new book by Maggie Haberman, famous New York Times journalist, staff apparently periodically discovered wads of printed paper clogging a toilet.
Yes.
This clearly being Trump's attempt to dispose of documents he didn't want being found. Why he's decided to do that, do it that way, only he knows. But I think it goes to a wider point, which is basically that the guy plainly did a lot of stuff that was borderline legal, if not just brazenly illegal. Did it very much in the public domain, owned it, and then used it as political strategy. And eventually, at that point, if there's enough interest in conviction or enough interest in investigating, that stuff will come up and it will catch up with you. So we now have a situation where the favourite to be elected president in a few years is actively under multiple investigations. And you have this battle between Trump basically staying afloat to run, because if he runs, he's got a big chance, quite possibly a favourite's chance of winning. And basically the battle to sort of get him, I don't know, sent down, sort of barred from
Imagine living in a country like that. How crazy.
I know, right? God, could you imagine? It'd be absolutely wild if our Prime Minister was under any sort of investigation.
But notwithstanding the US situation, the two favourites in both parties at the minute, what is their combined age at the next election? Like, we people retire at 65 for good reason. Like, why are we trusting people who are, Joe Biden, to me, his performances are showing a man who is struggling with the ways.
I think you're right. I don't agree, and I think we've got young
expectation on him because he's getting old. How have we systematically? What?
Sorry, so I don't think that Biden is performing so. I think the circumstances of the United States, inflation and such forth, and inheritance is a nightmare, and anyone would be having that. Okay, they are both old. I agree. It's stark how American politicians their leading politicians are all old. Pelosi and Mitch McConnell would be in the same ballpark. But at the same time, I mean, look at British politics. How many times have the smart voices in politics been the really experienced older politicians like Kenneth Clarke, right? Labour just went in with Corbyn for the last two elections, right? We've had a lot in Britain. We've had a lot of young, careerist, professional politicians for a long time. So I don't really think age is the factor.
He's 65.
Whether he's really good is another matter.
Yeah, Trump is 65 to get the nomination. How worried are you if you're on him in terms of all his legal cases?
I would have been. I'm not on him, and I have never been on him. I would be very worried. This is all coming to pass. The problem is we live in an age where everyone wants news tomorrow. Today, so it has to be immediate, and they forget about it all week. This stuff, particularly the New York stuff regarding Mazars and Deutsche Bank, this goes back decades, right? It is deep, and there's been lots of us who have been on this for years saying this will bring him down. And of course, whilst he was president, he managed to have all of those documents blocked, to block those investigations. But when you hear about what's been said in the hearings so far, it's totally damning, right? Trump, anyone who looks into Trump's lifestyle and career, his biographers, etc., in the 80s and 90s, the guy's completely criminalised. He always has been. It's ridiculous that he came to power and people were ever surprised of how he behaved, really.
So Neil, if I bring you in, who's more likable, Trump or Logan from Succession?
Sorry, say that again.
Trump or Logan from Succession, if you had to have dinner with one of them?
Logan.
Oh, I never watched that program. Everyone raved about it.
You need to watch it. Doesn't he need to watch Succession, gents?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Homework before next week.
Oh God.
Does he get there? Does he get to the next election, Neil?
I was starting to think he was value, but I think this news today is I haven't really got involved, so that's put me off a bit, really.
William.
I think he somehow does not. I still think he somehow does. And I think if he does, he wins the nomination at the least, and he doesn't go down by much in the election. I think you've still got the time probably to wait it out. I don't think you need to go in now. You can see how this stuff shapes up. You might even get a small drift if the news is looking really bad, because it will not suddenly go from one day he's a free man to the next day he's in cuffs or whatever. But I'm still of the opinion that if he runs, he certainly wins the nomination. I don't think anybody's massing up to that amount of support. But this is a bit of peril for him.
So, William, when do we have our northern polling odds? The first firm to do it, Sinn Féin on 23% are leading the polls at the moment. Questionable whether the old sectarian politics will come in if the DUP finish second. Will they nominate? Will they actually agree to have a Sinn Féin First Minister? A lot of electioneering going on this week, even in terms of sporting distribution of money and so forth. Fascinating time in the north. I think we need to price this up.
I agree, and I very much hope that we'd have prices for Northern Ireland for this year's local elections. I hope that we have a really big offering for this year's locals. Last year, I think we did well. I think we can go bigger this year, and Northern Ireland is certainly going to be, I think, one of the most watched elections on many fronts, like you've just described. Because make no mistake, you know, the union hasn't been talked about this year as much as it was last year, if only because we've had one big national story, and that's the one distracting. But it is never far away from the surface. And of course, recent issues with the protocol, and again, I'm not saying it's an issue with how the protocol works. It's these are all political decisions, in my opinion, have brought it right back to the forefront. So, no, absolutely, there's set to be a lot more developments there soon. I think something's got to come to a head at some point. I don't think the cycle over there can continue in perpetuity, but I am not speaking with a particularly informed opinion on that.
Yeah, that'll be fascinating. Thanks to Neil, Paul and William for today's show. We spoke about two elections in 2024 that took Neil's particular
fancy. I wish there was some by-elections.
Maybe there will be a by-election. Be careful what you wish for. We also talked about Donald Trump. We talked about Northern Ireland, and we'll talk about more next week.